The wind howled through the trees, a low, mournful cry that sent shivers down the spine of any who dared to linger too long in the forest's edge. This was no ordinary place, no mere collection of trees and soil. The forest of the hanging roots was a realm unto itself, its very existence laced with ancient power, whispered legends, and unspoken fear. Few knew its true name. Fewer still had ventured beyond the shadow of its dark boughs, and of those who did, none had returned whole, if they returned at all. The forest stood at the edge of a forgotten land, where the map grew faint and history seemed to fall away like crumbling parchment. Here, time behaved differently, as though the centuries hung suspended between the canopy and the earth, caught in a never-ending dance of decay and rebirth. The trees were ancient, taller than any others, their roots twisted and gnarled like the very fingers of the dead. No matter how you approached it, the forest felt alive, and that unnerving sensation seemed to crawl beneath your skin, like something far older than human consciousness was watching, waiting. It was the roots that gave the forest its name. Great, thick tendrils of dark, knotted wood twisted from the earth in unnatural directions, swaying and pulsing as though they had their own breath. There was no mistaking it. They were not mere trees. They were something far more sinister. These roots did not simply dig into the earth. They hung. They dangled like macabre ropes, reaching out over the ground, the air thick with the scent of damp earth, and something more pungent, something metallic. They seemed to beckon with every rustling movement, their eerie sway an invitation to those who dared to step too close. To those who had been there long enough to listen, the roots whispered, though no one could ever quite remember the words. They crept into your mind, a soft rustling sound, like paper fluttering in the breeze, or the distant scrape of bone on bone. When they spoke, they did not do so with a voice, but with the sensation of being pulled. The roots made it clear. The forest claimed those who entered, pulling them into its depths until their very souls were as tangled as the roots themselves. Some said the forest was cursed. Others believed it a dark temple, built long ago by those who sought the power of the earth itself. But one thing was certain. No one who had ventured into its heart ever returned the same. The surrounding villages knew better than to challenge the forest's power. Generations had passed since the last brave soul had disappeared, swallowed whole by the undergrowth. But even so, the people lived in the shadow of the hanging roots, their daily lives a quiet testament to the fear that lingered in every whispered prayer, in every furtive glance toward the tree line. They did not speak of the forest, but they all knew. It was an unspoken truth, an understanding woven into the very fabric of their existence. No one dared to ask about it, until the night the first person disappeared. It began with a stranger. His name was Thomas, a wanderer, a man whose feet had seen more roads than his mind cared to remember. He arrived at the village at dusk, tired from a long journey, seeking shelter from the coming storm. The villagers, always kind to travelers, offered him food and warmth, though they eyed him warily. They had learned to keep their distance from strangers, particularly those who were too eager to ask about the forest. Thomas, however, was not like other travelers. He was drawn to the forest, his curiosity piqued by the whispers and rumors that echoed through the town. Over dinner, as the wind began to howl outside, he asked the question that no one had dared to ask in years. What lies beyond the trees? The villagers froze, their faces draining of color as they looked at each other in silent horror. An uneasy silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire. The old woman sitting by the hearth, a woman known for her quiet wisdom, looked at him with pity in her eyes. "You don't want to know," she murmured, her voice trembling, though she tried to keep it steady. "The forest has a way of calling those who wander too close. It lures them in, only to take them. It doesn't give back what it takes." But Thomas was undeterred. His eyes gleamed with a kind of madness that only the truly curious could understand. "But what is it? What does it want?" The old woman's gaze turned sorrowful. She looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "It is the land's heart," she whispered. "It's not something you can see or touch or explain. You must leave it alone, for your own sake, and for the sake of the ones who came before you." That night, as Thomas lay in the small room they had given him, he could hear the wind howling through the cracks in the walls, the sound like 1,000 lost souls wailing in the distance. He could not sleep. Something about the forest was calling to him. He could feel it deep in his bones, as though the earth itself had reached up to touch him, urging him to come closer. At dawn, when the first rays of light crept over the horizon, Thomas quietly slipped out of the village. He made his way toward the edge of the forest, the ground damp beneath his feet, the trees looming ahead like silent sentinels. As he stepped into the shadow of the trees, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread, but also a thrill. An electric current that seemed to pulse through the air, tugging him deeper into the forest's embrace. It wasn't long before the village noticed his absence. They searched for him for days, but it was as though the forest had swallowed him whole. The wind carried his name, whispered on the air, but there were no footprints, no sign that he had ever been there. The villagers gathered in hushed groups, speaking in low voices, recounting the old stories, the legends that had once been so easily dismissed. They spoke of those who had ventured too close to the forest, who had heard the whispers, and who had never returned. They spoke of Thomas, and they wondered if he too had become one of the lost. The forest of the hanging roots was not a place of death, not entirely. It was a place of change, of transformation. And once it touched you, once its roots sank into your soul, you were never truly free. The forest did not simply kill. It consumed. It took what it wanted, and then it left behind an echo. And so the village waited, knowing what the forest would claim would never be seen again. But they waited with no hope. For the forest had already claimed another. The village stood like a forgotten relic at the edge of the forest, the lines between reality and myth blurred by time and fear. It had once been a thriving settlement, a place where children's laughter rang through the air and the sounds of daily life filled the streets. But now it seemed more a shadow than a true community, a place where silence reigned and only the bravest dared to venture beyond their doorsteps after dusk. The wind, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay, whispered through the narrow streets, curling around crooked buildings that seemed to groan under the weight of their age. And though the villagers would never say it aloud, every step they took felt as if it were haunted by something far older, far darker than they could comprehend. It was no secret that the land around the forest of the hanging roots was cursed. Generations had lived in the shadow of its twisted trees, and for as long as anyone could remember, strange happenings had followed in the wake of its proximity. What had begun as small, whispered fears, the feeling of being watched, of inexplicable chills running down the spine, had slowly evolved into something far more real, something that could no longer be ignored. The cursed villages that clung to the forest's borders were like ancient, brittle things, their very existence entwined with the dark history of the land. But the villagers didn't speak of it openly, not in the way they once might have. To talk too freely of the forest, of its power, was to invite its gaze upon you. And the gaze of the forest was a terrible thing to behold. The stories of the village's curse had been passed down through generations, carried on the breath of the old and the timid, whose lives had been touched by the terror that lived in the shadows. It was said that the curse had begun with a great tragedy, one long buried in the village's past, but always present, lingering like a rotting fruit left too long in the sun. A terrible disease had once swept through the village, its origins unknown, but its effects devastating. Families were torn apart, homes abandoned, and children buried in the earth before their time. It had taken many lives, but it was not the disease that left its lasting mark upon the village. It was the decisions that followed. The villagers, desperate for salvation, had turned to the forest, to the ancient trees that loomed just beyond the edge of the settlement, hoping to find something, anything, to halt the spreading death. They had made a pact. Desperation had driven them thus to it, and in the silence of the night they had whispered their promises into the darkened air. They sought the favor of the forest's unseen power, and in return, they offered themselves. The villagers had promised their blood, their souls, their lives, whatever the forest demanded. And the forest, ever patient, had accepted their offerings. From that night onward, the village had never been the same. The curse that had begun with the plague had been replaced by something far worse. A binding, a curse that rippled through every generation, tying the people of the village to the forest in ways that no one truly understood. No one could explain what had happened, but those who were born into the village felt it deep in their bones, a sense of dread that never quite left them, even in the brightest of days. The forest's influence crept into their dreams, twisted their thoughts, and pulled at the edges of their sanity. Some spoke of voices, low, beckoning whispers, that seemed to float just on the edge of hearing, always calling them toward the trees. And when the wind picked up, the trees seemed to sway in rhythm, as if they were waiting, listening. Perhaps it was the whispers that first caused the disappearances, the ones that started long before Thomas had even stepped foot in the village. Children, then young adults, began to vanish without a trace. Some were found miles away from the village, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Others simply vanished, leaving only a faint trace of something that could not be described. Their families were left to mourn, to wonder whether the forest of the hanging roots had taken them as it had taken so many before. But no one dared to speak openly of the forest's hold, for fear of invoking it, of calling down its terrible gaze. To speak its name too freely was to risk becoming its next victim. It was an unspoken rule that no one was to wander too far into the forest, not even during the day. The forest had its own rhythm, its own life, and to disrupt it was to anger whatever ancient thing lay at its heart. Yet, despite the villagers' best efforts to keep their distance, the forest's tendrils seemed to find their way into every corner of their lives. It affected their crops, their animals, even their health. Some said it was the land itself, twisted by the forest's power, that caused their misfortunes. Others whispered that the forest had grown hungry, and it demanded a steady supply of life to feed its endless thirst. The older generations had learned to fear the forest in ways that the younger ones could not yet comprehend. But even they could feel the presence of something darker, lurking in the trees, waiting, watching. It was said that the forest had a peculiar influence on the villagers' dreams. When they slept, their minds were not their own. Visions of the forest filled their slumber, and it was in those dreams that the villagers received their instructions, their warnings. Some were told to stay away, to not approach the trees. Others were summoned, beckoned by the ancient whispers of the forest, drawn to its depths with promises of something they could not resist. Those who followed the call were never seen again, their names added to the long list of the lost. Yet, in the deepest corners of the village, there were those who whispered that the forest was not just a place of death, but a place of rebirth. It could offer something, they claimed. It could grant wishes, fulfill desires. But always, there was a cost. And the price of that cost was steep, for the forest was no friend to the living. It was said that only the desperate, those who had nothing left to lose, would dare to seek the forest's favor. But even then, the forest would not be satisfied with a simple offering. It would demand something far more precious. The legend of the forest of the hanging roots had become a silent curse, a weight upon the villagers' hearts. They lived their lives in constant awareness of the forest's presence, of the pull it had on their souls. It was there, always lurking, in the background of their minds, in the whispers of the trees, in the creaking of the old buildings. They had come to accept it, to live in its shadow. But even as they did, they could not shake the feeling that one day the forest would come to claim them all. And when it did, there would be no place to hide. There would be no escape, for the forest was as much a part of them as the very blood that flowed through their veins. And so the village remained, perched at the edge of the abyss, waiting for the inevitable. The curse had already been sealed long ago. There was no turning back. The forest had already marked its claim, and it would take what it was owed when it was ready. For in the forest of the hanging roots, nothing was ever forgotten, least of all the dead. The air in the village grew thick with unspoken tension. The whispers of the forest, always present, began to grow louder, creeping into the corners of the villagers' minds like a slow, inevitable rot. The once simple, peaceful lives they had lived were slipping into a disquieting normalcy, where the chilling knowledge that something else walked alongside them, a darker, hungrier thing, had become as constant as the setting sun. And it was the young people of the village, with their reckless bravado and need to prove themselves, who were the first to feel the pull of the forest of the hanging roots. Of all those who had gone missing in the past, no one had sparked the same haunting terror in the village as the disappearance of Jacob, a young man whose spirit had always been too wild to be contained. Jacob was known for his love of adventure, for his defiance of the village's unspoken rules. Where others feared the dark, he reveled in it. And when the wind would howl through the trees, when the dark shapes of the forest would loom just beyond the village's reach, Jacob would laugh and walk closer, daring the forest to call to him. The villagers watched in silent horror, whispering among themselves, afraid that one day he would go too far. They had all heard the stories, the warnings passed down from one generation to the next, of those who had wandered too far into the forest and never returned. But Jacob's recklessness blinded him to their fears. He believed that the stories were just that, stories, myths, whispers. On a cool autumn evening, Jacob disappeared. It was not a grand event, nor a night filled with ominous signs. One moment, he was in the village, laughing with friends around the fire. The next, he was gone, vanished into the shadows of the forest. The wind had picked up that night, carrying with it a strange, almost seductive melody, like a song of some forgotten time, pulling him deeper into the woods. No one had seen him leave, and when the villagers began their search, they found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that he had ever existed in the forest at all. The disappearance was unlike any that had come before it. No body was ever found. No trace remained. It was as though Jacob had simply been erased from the world. But that was not the most terrifying part. The most terrifying part was that the villagers knew what had happened. They knew, deep in their bones, that the forest had taken him. The roots had claimed him, just as they had claimed so many before. And Jacob, like those who came before him, would never be the same again. For weeks, the village was gripped by a sense of dread. The air was heavy, as though the forest was watching them, waiting for something, anything, to set it in motion once more. The once bustling streets became eerily quiet, and the villagers' eyes always lingered nervously on the tree line. The shadow of the forest had grown longer, and it seemed to stretch further with each passing day. Yet, despite the terror that gripped them, they were helpless. They could only wait. Wait and pray that the forest, in its dark hunger, would pass them by. But then, one cold evening, Jacob returned. It was not the same Jacob who had left. The man who stumbled back into the village was a mere shell of the vibrant youth who had once laughed in the face of the forest. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt and hollow, and his eyes, those once bright eyes, were dark, endless pits of terror. He was silent, too silent, as if something had stripped away his ability to speak, to express anything. He moved like a sleepwalker, his steps slow and measured, as though the earth itself weighed heavily upon him. The villagers, upon seeing him, froze. There was no joy in his return, no relief. Only dread, an overwhelming fear that clung to them like a second skin. They knew what this meant. They had all heard the stories of those who returned from the forest. And in every one of those stories, the person who returned was never the same. They were hollowed out, broken, a mere shadow of their former selves, their minds lost to the dark power that lived beneath the roots. Jacob did not speak. He did not acknowledge the villagers as they gathered around him, wide-eyed and fearful. Instead, he walked to the center of the village, where the fire still burned. He stood there for a long while, staring at the flames, his gaze distant and unseeing. Then, without warning, he turned and began walking toward the forest again. The villagers tried to stop him, shouting his name, grabbing at his arms. But he was like a creature of stone, unmoving, unfeeling. There was nothing human left in him. He was merely a puppet, a marionette caught in the forest's grasp. And though they pulled and pleaded with him, Jacob did not respond. He simply walked, as if the forest had already claimed him once more, his body now an extension of its will. Some say he reached the forest's edge before he vanished again, swallowed by the same dark void that had taken him the first time. Others claim that they saw him standing in the trees, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light, a twisted mockery of the man he had once been. Whatever the truth was, the villagers knew the answer. The forest had taken him again, but this time it would not let him return. The forest did not release its grasp easily. The village was never the same after Jacob's return. Those who had once been skeptical of the old stories began to believe. For how could they not? Jacob was the proof, the living testament to the fact that the forest had power, a power that could take a man and leave him broken, twisted, and hollow. They spoke in hushed tones of the walkers, those who had ventured into the forest and returned changed. There were others, of course. Others who had ventured into the forest and never returned at all. But the ones who returned, the ones who survived, were the true horror. Their minds were never whole again. They were never truly free. Jacob was not the first to return from the forest, but he was the most striking. He was the most alive. But even that was a lie. In the end, he was no more than the shadow of his former self, a vessel for the forest's power, a hollow echo of the man he had once been. The villagers, shaken and broken, knew what they had to do. They knew that the forest would continue to claim its victims and that there was no escaping its reach. It was an inevitability, something written into the very soil beneath their feet. But they also knew that for some, the forest did not just take their bodies, it took their souls too, and those souls were not easily freed. And so, they waited. The forest would call again, and the walkers would return. But there would always be one thing they could not escape: the truth. The forest did not give back what it took. It only took and took again, forever. The forest had always been a source of mystery, a place where no one dared to venture, and those who did seldom returned with more than the whispered ghost of a story. But as time passed, the villagers found themselves driven by an unrelenting curiosity, an insatiable need to understand the nature of the curse that loomed over them, to uncover the truth buried deep in the soil beneath their feet. And it was a truth that lay hidden beneath the roots, in the dark heart of the forest. It was there, where the sunlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy above, that the oldest secrets waited, secrets that, once uncovered, would bind the villagers even more tightly to the forest's ancient will. The disappearance of Jacob had been a turning point for many. His return had cast a long shadow over the village, sparking fear, anger, and confusion in equal measure. For some, the forest was no longer a distant horror. It had become a living, breathing entity, one whose presence was felt in every creaking tree and every whispered wind. But it was not just fear that had gripped them. Along with it came an overwhelming sense of dread and, perhaps more unsettlingly, a growing sense of inevitability. The curse that had long been whispered about in hushed tones was no longer a mere superstition. It had become a reality that could not be ignored. The village was trapped, bound to the forest by forces far older and more powerful than anything they had imagined. Yet still, the questions lingered. What was the true nature of the forest? What had it been before it became a place of terror? Was it always meant to consume, to change, to claim? Or had it been twisted, corrupted, into something darker by the villagers' pact, made so long ago in their desperation? The answers came when the youngest of the village's elders, a woman named Agnes, began to speak. She had always been quiet, keeping to herself. But there was something in the way she carried herself now that suggested a burden, a knowledge that could no longer be ignored. Agnes was the granddaughter of the last living person to speak directly to the forest before the first curse took hold. The story she told would change everything, for it was not just a tale of desperation and magic. It was the revelation of a terrible truth, one that would bind the village to the forest forever. As Agnes sat in front of the fire, her gnarled hands resting on her lap, she spoke softly, her voice low but steady, as though she were speaking not to the villagers before her, but to the trees themselves. "The forest was not always like this," she began, her eyes distant, as if seeing the past unfold before her. "It was once a place of life, of peace. Long ago, before the curse took hold, the forest was a sanctuary for the people of this land. It was where we found our strength, where we came to heal, to gather. It was sacred, Our ancestors revered it. They offered prayers and gifts to the spirits that resided within its roots, seeking guidance and protection. She paused, the flickering flames casting shadows across her face. The villagers sat in silence, the weight of her words heavy in the air. But over time, Agnes continued, her voice growing quieter, the forest began to change. Slowly, imperceptibly at first. There were rumors, whispers of something darker lurking within, something that had been awakened by the blood of our ancestors. It was not something we understood at the time, but those who came after began to feel it too. The forest grew restless, and its whispers grew louder. It no longer spoke of peace, but of power. It offered strength, yes, but it demanded something in return. Agnes's gaze turned to the fire, her eyes flickering with the light of memories long buried. It was our ancestors' greed, their hunger for more that called the darkness. The forest, in its ancient wisdom, knew that the price of power was not a small one. Yet still they came, each one, hoping for more, hoping to take what they could from the forest, without giving anything in return. The balance that had once existed was shattered. Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if speaking aloud might invite the forest itself to listen. That was when the first of the trees began to twist, to change. The roots, they grew hungry, pulling from the earth more than the land could give. And when the first blood was spilled, when our ancestors made the first of their unholy pacts, that was when the forest's curse began to take root. The roots themselves, they were not just living things. They were watchers, ancient spirits bound to the land. The forest was not merely a place, it was a guardian. But the forest could not protect what it had once nurtured. There was a long silence, the weight of her words settling like a fog over the room. The village, the land itself, had been bound to the forest by that pact. Agnes continued, her voice shaking with emotion now. It was not just a curse that was cast upon us. It was a bond, a chain, forged in desperation. The price of that power was not gold, nor land, nor simple sacrifice. It was the souls of the people, bound to the forest for all eternity. A murmur rippled through the villagers, but Agnes raised a hand, silencing them. The forest is not a force of evil, as we've come to believe, she said, her voice steady once more. It is not the curse itself. It is the result of our ancestors' actions. They did not understand what they had done, what they had awoken. They thought they could control it, but the forest was always watching, always waiting. And when it began to feed, when it began to claim, it did so with no regard for the lives it touched. The room was deathly still. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting erratic shadows across the walls. Jacob's return was no accident, Agnes said, her gaze piercing. He is the first of many who will come back. He is the beginning of the end. The villagers stared at her, wide-eyed with disbelief. But Agnes did not look away. She held their gaze, her eyes hard, as though daring them to deny what they had already felt in their bones. There is no escaping this, she said, her voice a low, grim certainty. The forest's hunger cannot be sated by offering it sacrifices. It feeds on more than that. It feeds on the very essence of our souls, the darkness that lies within us all. And it will continue to take until there is nothing left. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. The villagers had always feared the forest, but now they understood. The forest was not simply a place of darkness. It was a living thing, a sentient force that had been awakened by their ancestors' choices. And now they were bound to it, trapped in its dark grip, powerless to escape. The truth was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was out in the open, staring them in the face. And with that revelation, a new kind of terror settled over the village. It was not the fear of the unknown, but the fear of inevitability. The forest would claim them all, one by one. And when it did, it would not stop until the last soul had been consumed, until the village was no more than a memory, a fading echo of a forgotten time. The forest was not done with them yet. Not by a long shot. The villagers had always known that the forest held more than just the whisper of trees and the rustle of leaves. There was something else. Something older, more unsettling. It was the feeling that there were eyes watching them from the shadows. Eyes that saw everything, that remembered everything. The forest was not just a place of death, but a resting place for the souls that had been claimed by it, lost to its dark embrace. And though they could not hear their voices in the daylight, the villagers knew that the dead did not rest quietly. The forest was their grave, and it called to them, compelling them to return, not as they were, but as something else, something more terrifying. The first of the dead to return was a woman named Eleanor, who had disappeared years before, along with her young child. The villagers had long given up on ever finding her, the pain of loss having faded into something more like resignation. Eleanor had been a quiet woman, known for her kindness and gentle nature. When she vanished, it had been as though a part of the village had gone with her. No one spoke of her disappearance in detail anymore. It was just another tragic event, another casualty of the forest. But Eleanor's return was anything but quiet. It happened on a night when the air was thick with fog, and the wind carried an eerie calm. The village was wrapped in a quiet unease, as if everyone was waiting for something, though none could say what. It was then that she appeared. Just as the clock struck midnight, a figure emerged from the mist. At first, the villagers thought it was a trick of the light, the fog playing tricks on their tired eyes. But as the figure drew closer, they saw her clearly. It was Eleanor, or at least it looked like her. Her body was gaunt, skin pulled tight over the bones as though the flesh had been hollowed out. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with a hollow, unnatural light. She was dressed in the same clothes she had worn the day she disappeared, tattered and stained with the passage of time. But what struck the villagers the most was the emptiness in her gaze. It was as if she had forgotten what it was to be human, as though the forest had taken everything from her, leaving only the shell of the woman she once was. Eleanor stood in the center of the village, staring into the distance, unmoving. Her lips were parted, but no sound came from them. The villagers approached cautiously, their hearts pounding in their chests, their breath coming in shallow gasps. They whispered her name, but she didn't respond. There was no recognition in her eyes, no sign that she remembered them, or anything of her life before the forest had taken her. And then, the whispering began. At first, it was faint, a barely perceptible murmur that seemed to come from the trees, from the very air itself. It grew louder, rising in pitch, until it became a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, all calling to the villagers. The words were impossible to make out, a blur of sounds that filled the night like 1,000 voices trapped within the roots of the trees. And through it all, Eleanor stood motionless, as though the voices were not for her. They were for the village. They were meant for them. The villagers tried to approach her, to speak to her, but their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming sound of the whispers. And then, Without warning, Eleanor turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto one of the villagers, a man named Thomas, who had once been close to her before her disappearance. He froze under her stare, his breath catching in his throat. There was nothing human in her eyes, only the empty, cold gaze of something ancient and unforgiving. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice barely a tremor in the silence. Her lips moved, but the words that came from her mouth were not her own. They were a chorus of voices, whispers and cries that seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth. "They never stop. They never leave. You will never leave." The words were both a warning and a curse. They echoed in Thomas's mind long after the sound of Eleanor's voice had faded. He could feel the weight of her words settle upon him, as though they were a death sentence, a fate from which there was no escape. He staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest, his thoughts racing. The whispers had already begun to fade, the wind carrying them off into the night. But the feeling lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over the village. Eleanor's body crumpled to the ground, her form collapsing into the fog. And when the villagers rushed forward, she was gone. There was no trace of her, no sign of her presence, save for the lingering feeling of dread that hung in the air. But the whispers continued. They could still hear them, faintly, like a low hum in the back of their minds. The voices of the dead, trapped in the forest, never truly leaving. They were echoes now, but they were not silenced. It was not the first time the dead had returned, and it would not be the last. As the villagers looked out into the fog, they knew that the forest had begun to reclaim what it had lost. The dead were coming back, not to rest, but to remind the living of the curse that bound them all. The forest did not forget. It never forgot. The village had become a place of mourning, a place where the dead still walked among the living. It was not the simple, peaceful village it once was. It had become a liminal space, a place where the boundary between life and death was thin, where the dead walked with the living, and the living could never escape the whispers of those who had been claimed by the forest. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, in trembling whispers, of those who had been lost and those who had returned. They said that the forest had begun to take more than just bodies. It had begun to take their souls. It had begun to leave behind only shadows, only echoes. The spirits of the dead no longer rested. They were bound to the roots, their souls tangled in the dark embrace of the forest. And so, the village remained, haunted by the dead and by the memories of those who had been claimed. The forest had taken much, but it had not taken everything. There were still those who remembered, those who whispered the names of the lost. But even as they did, they knew that the whispers would not stop. The dead would always return, and they would never be at rest. For in the forest of the hanging roots, the dead did not rest. They only waited. The whispers of the dead were not the only thing that filled the air around the village. In the quietest moments, when the fog rolled in thick and the wind carried the scent of the earth, the villagers began to feel another presence. Something darker, something far more dangerous than the spirits that haunted their dreams. It was a presence that had always been there, buried deep in the history of the village, hidden behind the veil of superstition and forgotten rituals. It was the remnants of a cult, a secret society whose power, once hidden beneath layers of time and silence, was now stirring once again, reaching out from the shadows to reclaim what it had lost. The cult of the roots had once been a powerful force in the village, its influence stretching deep into the fabric of the community. Its members had been the ones to broker the original pact with the forest. The ones who had dared to make a deal with the darkness that dwelled within the roots. They had been the first to understand the true nature of the forest, to glimpse the ancient power that pulsed through its veins. And when the forest had offered its strength, they had been the ones to accept it, binding the village and themselves forever to the forest's will. The cult had been built upon the belief that the forest was not simply a place, but a living, breathing entity that could be controlled, harnessed, and used to grant immense power. Its members had believed that through the right rituals and sacrifices, they could commune with the spirits that resided within the roots, bending them to their will. They had studied the ancient texts, deciphered forgotten languages, and performed unholy ceremonies under the cover of night, all in the pursuit of power beyond comprehension. In their eyes, the forest was not something to be feared. It was something to be controlled, something to be revered and used for their own gain. But the forest, as the villagers soon learned, had no interest in being controlled. It was not a tool to be wielded by those who thought they could master it. The cult's attempts to harness its power had awakened something far darker, something that could not be contained. The roots, once quiet and still, began to twist and grow with an insatiable hunger. The whispers that had once been faint grew louder, more insistent, until they were a deafening chorus that echoed through the hearts of the cult members. And then, one by one, they disappeared, drawn into the very darkness they had sought to control. The last known members of the cult of the roots were said to have vanished one fateful night, leaving behind only the remnants of their twisted rituals. Their symbols, carved into the bark of the oldest trees, remained as a haunting reminder of what had been and what could never be again. But even as the cult faded into history, its influence did not disappear. It lingered in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. It was this ancient presence that the villagers began to feel again in the wake of the events surrounding Jacob's return. The whispers had grown louder, more urgent, as though the forest itself was reaching out, calling to them. The villagers, already fearful of the forest's grip, now found themselves being drawn into something far more insidious. They began to notice strange symbols appearing on the trees, scratched into the earth, or scrawled on the walls of their homes in the dead of night. The symbols were familiar, but twisted, remnants of the cult's once secret language. It was as though the forest was trying to remind them of something, to draw them back into its fold. And then, one by one, certain villagers began to change. It started with the children, those too young to understand the history of the forest and the curse that hung over them. They began to speak in strange, cryptic phrases, their voices eerily calm and detached, as though they were channeling something beyond their years. They would wander into the woods at night, their eyes glazed over, their footsteps steady as they followed the invisible pull of the forest. Parents would wake to find their children missing, only to have them return hours later, their faces pale, their eyes empty, as though they had seen something far beyond the reach of mortal understanding. It wasn't long before the adults began to change as well. It started with a few whispered words, strange incantations muttered under their breath, phrases that held no meaning but seemed to carry a weight that could not be ignored. The villagers began to gather in secret, meeting in the dead of night beneath the thick canopy of the forest. They spoke of the past, of the pact their ancestors had made, of the ancient force that had once been controlled by the cult. They spoke of the symbols, of the rituals, of the power that still lingered in the roots. It was during one of these gatherings that the truth became clear. The cult of the roots had never truly disappeared. It had only gone into hiding, waiting for the right time to resurface. And now, the time had come. The villagers were being drawn back into the forest's grasp, not by the whisper of the dead, but by the force of the cult's long-buried influence. They were not merely victims of the forest's hunger. They were its heirs, its chosen. At the heart of the village, a small group of individuals had begun to piece together the truth. They had been the first to notice the symbols, the strange behavior of their neighbors, and the whispers that filled the air. They were the ones who dared to speak openly of the cult's return, of the ancient rituals that had been set into motion once again. And as they gathered in the dead of night, their voices low and fearful, they realized something terrifying. The forest was not simply feeding on the villagers. It was preparing them for something greater. The cult's ultimate goal had never been power for power's sake. It had never been about control over the forest itself. The true purpose of the cult had always been to awaken the heart of the forest, the ancient, primordial force that slumbered deep within the roots. This force was not bound by mortal laws, not constrained by the passage of time. It was a force that transcended life and death, a force that could reshape the very fabric of reality itself. The cult had believed that by offering themselves to the forest, by giving up their humanity, they could become something greater, something eternal, something beyond death. And now, the village was being drawn into that same fate. The villagers, those who had become aware of the cult's return, realized they had two choices: to fight against the forest, to try and break the curse once and for all, or to give in to its power, to join the cult in their quest for immortality. And in that moment, the village was torn. Those who still believed in the old ways, those who had grown up fearing the forest's power, were determined to resist. But those who had tasted the whispers of the roots, who had felt the pull of the ancient power, were willing to sacrifice anything, to surrender their souls in exchange for eternal life. The forest was not just a place of death, not just a place of evil. It was a place of transformation. And it was hungry for those who would embrace its power, hungry for those willing to give up everything in exchange for the promise of eternal life. It had already begun to claim them, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed them all. The cult of the roots had risen again, and this time it would not be stopped. The fog had settled over the village like a suffocating blanket, thick and unyielding. It clung to the narrow streets and twisted alleys, creeping into homes, into hearts, and into minds. The village, once a quiet haven nestled on the edge of the forest of the hanging roots, was now a place of unease and growing terror. The air itself seemed heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken fear and dread. The whispers, once barely audible, had become a constant presence, echoing in the minds of the villagers as they went about their daily lives. They could no longer escape the forest's call. It wasn't just the forest that had begun to take hold of the village. It was the growing sense of madness that was spreading like wildfire through the people. It started small at first, a flicker in the eyes of the villagers, a moment of hesitation, as if they were suddenly unsure of who they were or what they had once believed. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. The madness spread like a disease, infecting one mind after another, until there was no longer any distinction between those who had succumbed to it and those who still clung to their sanity. The line between reality and the nightmare of the forest had begun to blur, and no one knew where the madness began or the forest ended. It was the children who were the first to show the signs. At first, it was subtle. Whispers, murmurs in the dead of night, like the faintest rustling of leaves in the wind. But the whispers grew louder, and the children's behavior grew stranger. They began to speak of things no child should know, of the forest's heart, of the roots that whispered beneath the earth, of the spirits that roamed within the trees. They would wander into the woods at night, drawn by an unseen force, and return hours later, their faces pale and their eyes wide with an unnatural gleam. They would say nothing. But the air around them grew thick with the presence of something far older than childhood innocence. The adults watched in growing horror, unable to understand what was happening to their children. They sought explanations in the village's old traditions, turning to the elders, to the rituals and prayers passed down through the generations. But the answers they found were not the ones they had hoped for. The elders spoke in hushed tones, fearful of the knowledge they carried. The curse had taken root in the children, and with it, the madness had spread. It was not just the forest that had awakened. It was the cult, the remnants of that ancient society that had once sought to control the forest's power. The cult had risen again, and now it was no longer a secret society lurking in the shadows. It was in the very bones of the village, in the very blood of its people. The cult had always known that the forest's power was not to be controlled. It was to be embraced, and those who embraced it would be forever bound to the roots, to the forest's eternal hunger. The children, innocent and pure, had become the perfect vessels for the forest's dark influence. The madness was not just a symptom. It was the result of the forest's will, a will that had been awakened by the cult's rituals. The whispers were the call of the roots, the ancient voice of the forest itself, reaching out to those who were susceptible, to those who could be drawn into its embrace. The village was no longer a haven. It was a prison, and the madness was the key that unlocked its gates. The madness was not confined to the children alone. As the days passed, more and more villagers began to succumb to the forest's influence. The madness took many forms. Some became withdrawn, their eyes vacant, their minds consumed by the whispers of the roots. Others became violent, their minds twisted by the forest's hunger, lashing out at anyone who came too close. The village, once peaceful and quiet, had become a place of fear and chaos. The villagers no longer spoke of the forest with the same awe and reverence they once had. Now, they spoke of it with terror, with the knowledge that it was not something to be revered or feared. It was something that had already claimed them. The elders, those who had survived the first wave of the cult's rise, gathered in secret, fearful of the fate that awaited them all. They knew the truth, that the forest would not stop, that the madness would continue to spread until there was nothing left. But the roots, the whispering voices, and the hunger of the forest, the village had already been marked, its people already claimed. There was no escaping the madness. The only choice left was to give in, to embrace the forest, to surrender to the roots, and to become part of the eternal darkness that pulsed beneath the earth. But even as the elders spoke of surrender, there were those who fought against the pull of the forest. There were those who had not yet succumbed to the madness, those who still clung to the belief that they could break the curse, that they could escape the forest's grasp. These few, the last remnants of the village's original inhabitants, began to form a resistance. They spoke of rebellion, of defiance, of standing against the forest's power. But their words were hollow. They knew, deep down, that the forest had already won. It was too late. The resistance fought against the forest's pull, but they were fighting an enemy they could not see. The forest was not just a physical place, it was a presence, a will that existed beyond the confines of reality. It could reach into their minds, twist their thoughts, turn their hearts against one another. And so, the resistance began to fracture. Some turned away, drawn back into the madness. Others, too terrified to continue, fled the village altogether, seeking refuge in the distant hills. But even they knew that there was no escape. The forest's influence stretched far beyond the village's borders. No one was safe. And so the village descended into chaos. The madness spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. The children, those innocent vessels, had become the harbingers of the forest's will, and the villagers had become its prey. It was not a quick death, but a slow, agonizing unraveling. The roots twisted deeper into the earth, and the whispers grew louder, calling to those who would listen. And in the end, there was no one left who could hear anything but the sound of the roots, the call of the forest, the promise of eternal hunger. The village, once a place of life, had become a place of death. The forest had claimed it, just as it had claimed the souls of those who had gone before. The madness had spread, and with it, the village's fate was sealed. The forest's grip was tightening, and there was nothing left to hold on to. But even as the last remnants of the village were consumed by the roots, there was a single, lingering thought that haunted the survivors. For though the village was lost, though the madness had claimed them all, the forest was not finished. It was only just beginning. The roots were still hungry, and the whispers would never cease. And when the last of the village's ashes had been swallowed by the earth, the forest would wait. Wait for the next to come. Wait for the next to listen to the whispers, to feel the pull of the roots. The madness had spread, and it would continue to spread, forever. The night had always felt different in the village. The dark hours seemed to stretch on forever, shrouded in an unnatural stillness that only grew heavier with time. But now, the stillness had become something far more unsettling, an oppressive weight that pressed down on the villagers' chests, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. The whispers had grown louder, more distinct, like voices speaking from deep within the earth, rising up from the very roots of the trees. They were no longer the faint rustlings of leaves or the distant murmur of wind. No, these were the voices of something alive, something that knew them, knew their fears, and whispered them back into the air with cruel precision. In the beginning, it had been easy to dismiss the whispers. They were just sounds, faint and indistinct, something that could be ignored. But as the village had slipped deeper into madness, the whispers had become impossible to ignore. They had grown insistent, louder, calling to the villagers in their sleep, drawing them toward the forest as though the roots themselves had become sentient. The trees seemed to stretch their limbs outward, as though reaching for the people, pulling them in, promising them something they could not resist. And it wasn't just the whispers that had changed. The village, once a place of life and community, had become a hollow shell, its streets empty, its houses abandoned. The people had begun to leave, fleeing in the dead of night, driven by an unseen force. They spoke of hearing voices, of feeling the ground beneath them shift, as though the earth itself was alive, moving in ways it should not. But they couldn't explain what had driven them away. They just knew they had to go. And when they left in silence, slipping away like ghosts, never to return. The few who remained were the ones who had listened to the forest, who had felt the call of the roots and had given in. It was they who were the most dangerous now. They walked with the forest's hunger in their eyes, their souls twisted and bent, their minds consumed by the voices that whispered through the trees. They were the ones who had answered the call, who had embraced the darkness and the power it promised. But even as they gave in, the villagers couldn't ignore the truth that had become clear to them. The voices were not just whispers anymore. They had become something more, something far darker and more insidious. They were commands, instructions, beckoning the villagers to do things they would never have considered before. The forest was speaking to them now, not in riddles or cryptic messages, but in clear, direct commands. The voices told them what to do, when to move, when to kill. And each time they followed the call, it grew stronger, more insistent. No one had been immune to the pull of the roots, not even the village's strongest. When the whispers first began, there were those who had tried to resist, to lock themselves away from the forest's influence. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more persistent, until it became impossible to ignore. The voices crept into dreams, into waking moments, curling around the villagers' minds like tendrils, feeding them thoughts, desires, fears. The roots reached deep into their consciousness, pulling at their innermost thoughts until there was no longer a distinction between what was real and what was the forest's manipulation. The voices never stopped. They were always there, lurking in the edges of consciousness, waiting for the right moment to speak, to command. It was said that those who had truly surrendered to the forest's will could hear the voices even in the deepest sleep. They spoke of a power beyond comprehension, of a knowledge that existed within the forest, in the very roots of the trees. They promised eternal life, immortality beyond death, in exchange for their service. The villagers who listened, who followed the whispers, were promised an existence beyond time. But what they didn't know was that the price of that immortality was not just their lives. It was their souls. The voices spoke of a time long ago, of the creation of the forest, of the dark force that lay at its center. They spoke of the spirits of the earth, ancient and powerful, who had once walked freely among the living. They spoke of an ancient pact, a promise made by those who sought power, who sought to control the forces that bound the world together. And they promised that the time had come for the forest to awaken, for the roots to reclaim what had once been taken from them. The villagers who had embraced the whispers, who had given themselves to the forest's will, could feel it in their bones. The earth trembled beneath their feet. The trees groaned in the wind, and the roots twisted deeper into the soil, spreading their influence, pulling them closer. The power of the forest was alive, and it had no mercy. It had claimed them, body and soul, and now they were bound to it, just as their ancestors had been. But not all the villagers had given in. Some, still clinging to the hope of salvation, gathered in secret, speaking in hushed tones of escape, of resistance. They knew the forest was not something to be fought with weapons or strength. It was a force of nature, a living, breathing entity that could not be defeated. The only way to break free from its grasp was to destroy what bound them to it. They had to destroy the roots, to sever the connection that had been made so long ago. But how could they fight something so ancient, so powerful? The villagers, desperate for answers, began to search the village's history for clues, for any sign that could help them. It was then that they uncovered the truth about the cult that had once controlled the forest, the dark power that had been awakened by their rituals. The cult had never truly died. It had only gone underground, its influence still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The voices that now filled the air were not just the whispers of the dead. They were the voices of the cult, still speaking, still reaching out, still trying to claim what had been promised to them. The truth was clear now. The forest had never been a place of peace or sanctuary. It was a place of control, a place where the roots had taken hold of the very fabric of reality itself. The voices were not merely the echoes of the dead. They were the commands of something far darker, something that had been hidden beneath the earth for centuries. The roots were alive, and they had a hunger that could never be sated. But even as the villagers realized the terrible truth, they could not escape. The voices had already claimed them, already twisted their minds and hearts. They were bound to the forest, to the roots that had reached into their souls. And now there was no going back. The whispers had become commands, and there was no resisting them. They had answered the call, and now they were part of the forest. The voices continued to whisper, now louder than ever, guiding them into the depths of the forest, where the roots grew thick and the air was heavy with the promise of something ancient, something eternal. They had been claimed, body and soul, and there was no escaping the hunger of the forest. The voices would never stop. They would always call, always whisper, always demand. And when the last of the villagers had been consumed by the roots, the forest would wait. It would wait for the next to listen, for the next to hear the whispers and feel the pull. The voices in the roots would never cease. They were eternal, and they would never stop calling. The village was no longer a village, but a hushed memory. The once bustling streets lay abandoned, their homes dark and silent, only the distant cries of the wind stirring the air. The remaining villagers, those who had not been claimed by the roots or lost to the madness, had retreated into the shadows of their own minds, their lives forever altered by the curse that had taken hold of their souls. And yet, even in the face of such despair, the forest's grip remained unbroken. It still waited, still watched, its hunger insatiable. Its whispers echoed through the empty streets, through the crumbling buildings, through the hollow hearts of those left behind. But then, something happened. A figure emerged from the edge of the forest, a man walking as though the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. His step was steady, sure, as though the forest had released its grip and let him go. His face was unrecognizable at first glance. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and worn. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of understanding, that sent a cold shiver down the spine of anyone who looked upon him. He was not someone who had been lost forever. He was someone who had returned. Jacob. The name came to the lips of the few survivors who still roamed the village's outskirts. They had not seen him in years, since the night he had disappeared into the forest, swallowed whole by its hunger. They had given him up for dead, a victim of the same fate that had claimed so many others. But here he was, standing before them, as though nothing had changed, as though he had simply walked out of the shadows of the forest, free of its curse. But the truth of his return was more terrifying than any of them could have imagined. The villagers, those who had not yet fallen prey to the madness, gathered around him, unsure of what to say or do. Their eyes searched his face, hoping to find the Jacob they once knew. The Jacob who had laughed, who had dared the forest to take him, who had always been so full of life. But what they saw now was a man broken, hollowed out, his mind lost to the same dark force that had consumed so many before him. He spoke to them, his voice low, barely more than a whisper. The forest. It does not forget. It takes and it keeps. Forever. His words sent a chill through the survivors. But it was his eyes, those eyes, that held the most terrifying truth. They were not his eyes anymore. They were something else, something older, something bound to the very heart of the forest. His gaze swept over the villagers, and for a moment, it was as though he were not looking at them at all. He was looking through them, as though seeing something far beyond their physical form, seeing the roots of the forest, seeing the darkness that had claimed them all. The forest. It changes you. Jacob continued, his voice cracking with the weight of his words. Once you answer its call, once you listen to the whispers, there's no going back. It consumes you. It becomes you. The villagers recoiled, their hearts heavy with the truth of his words. They had all heard the stories, had seen the madness take hold of those who had dared to venture too close to the roots. But to hear it spoken so plainly by one who had returned from the forest's depths was something else entirely. Jacob was no longer a man. He was something far worse, something shaped by the forest, twisted by its hunger, and yet not fully part of it. "We thought you were dead," one of the villagers said, her voice trembling. "We thought you had been taken by the forest." Jacob shook his head, a bitter smile curling on his lips. "I was never dead," he said, his voice hollow. "But I was lost. I became part of the forest, and the forest became part of me." The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended in the fog, until they reached the hearts of those who still held on to hope. The forest had not just claimed Jacob's body, it had claimed his soul, his very being. And yet, he had returned. The realization slowly began to dawn upon them, like a distant storm on the horizon. The forest was not done with them. Jacob's return was not a miracle. It was a warning, a harbinger of something far worse. The whispers began again, soft at first, like a sigh carried on the wind, but growing louder as the seconds passed. The villagers looked around, their eyes wide with fear. They could hear it now, the faint murmur of voices calling from the edge of the forest, calling to Jacob, calling to them. And then it happened. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, as though the forest itself was stirring. The trees groaned and creaked in the wind, their branches twisting and turning, as though reaching for something, grasping for something just out of reach. The roots, hidden beneath the earth, began to move, shifting and slithering like serpents, crawling through the soil, pulling at the very foundation of the village. The air grew thick, charged with an energy that was both electrifying and suffocating. Jacob's eyes narrowed as he felt the pull. His face twisted in a grimace, as though he were fighting an invisible force. He stumbled forward, his hands outstretched, as though he were trying to break free of something that was tightening around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. "They're coming," he gasped, his voice strained. "The forest is calling me back. It will take me again, and it will take you too. All of you." The villagers watched in horror as Jacob fell to his knees, his body trembling as though he were being torn apart from the inside out. His breath came in shallow gasps, his face contorting in pain. He looked up at them, his eyes wide with terror, as if he were seeing something far beyond their reach. "You can't stop it," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "No one can." Before they could respond, before they could even think, the ground split open before them, A great chasm appeared, deep and dark, swallowing the earth, the trees, and everything in its path. The whispers grew deafening, now a cacophony of voices, screaming, begging, demanding. And then, out of the darkness, the roots began to rise. They were thick, gnarled, and twisting, alive with an ancient hunger. They surged upward, reaching for Jacob, for the villagers, for the very heart of the village. The roots were no longer just a part of the forest. They were the forest, and they were taking back what had been stolen from them. Jacob's body jerked, as though it were being dragged toward the chasm. His scream was swallowed by the wind, lost to the madness that had already consumed him. And as the roots wrapped around his body, pulling him into the earth, he was lost once more. The villagers could only watch as the forest claimed him, as it claimed them all. There was no escape. The roots had spoken, and they had answered. The forest's hunger could not be satisfied. It would never stop, and in the end, there would be no survivors. Only the roots, only the whispers, only the eternal, insatiable darkness. The village, once a place of life, had been reduced to a hushed, forgotten memory. A hollow shell consumed by the endless hunger of the forest of the hanging roots. The streets, now overgrown with vines and creeping tendrils, lay silent, as though the forest itself had wrapped its arms around the village, pulling it into its depths. The wind that had once carried the scent of fresh earth and open skies now carried the heavy, suffocating weight of decay, of something long dead. The village was no longer a place of warmth or light. It had become part of the forest, its roots twisting through the very soil, its whispers echoing in the hollow spaces where human voices once lived. It had all started with the promise of power, with the naive belief that the forest could be controlled, that its ancient forces could be harnessed for the benefit of humankind. But as the villagers had learned too late, there was no controlling the forest. There was only surrender. And the forest had claimed them all, one by one. The roots had taken their bodies, their souls, and in the end, their very essence. But now, in the dead of night, when the village was swallowed by the eternal darkness of the forest, something shifted. It wasn't the wind, nor the rustle of the trees that stirred in the air. It was the absence of sound. The stillness that filled the air was unnatural, as though the world had held its breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for something to awaken. The forest had been quiet for too long. The roots that had once twisted through the earth beneath the village now pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, as though the forest itself was breathing. The whispers had ceased. The voices that had once called out in maddening frenzy were now silent, leaving only an eerie emptiness behind. The earth beneath the village was cold, too cold, like the air of a tomb. The roots lay dormant for the moment, but there was a sense of something shifting beneath the surface, a tension that pressed upon the land. And then it began. From deep within the earth, from the very heart of the forest, a low rumble shook the ground. It was soft at first, a tremor that made the very air hum with energy, like the crackling of distant thunder. But the tremor grew, louder, stronger, more insistent. The ground cracked, splitting open like the mouth of some ancient beast awakening from its slumber. The roots that had been buried deep in the earth began to rise, slowly at first, as though testing the air, then more quickly, as if the earth itself were being pulled apart. The villagers, those few who still remained, stood at the edge of the village, watching in awe, in terror, as the earth tore itself apart before them. The roots reached up, thick and black, their twisted forms coiling in the moonlight like serpents, their gnarled bodies pulsing with the same unnatural rhythm as the earth beneath them. The ground around them shifted and cracked as though something enormous was stirring beneath the soil, something that had lain dormant for far too long. In the center of the village, the ground split wide open. From the darkness that had taken root there, something began to rise. It was not a figure of flesh and bone, not a man or a woman. It was something older, something far more ancient. It was the heart of the forest, the thing that had once lived, that had once ruled, before the world had forgotten it. The thing that had been awakened by the cult, that had been bound to the land by pacts older than memory. It had been slumbering, waiting for the right moment to return, to reclaim what had been taken from it. And now, it was awake. The villagers, those who had not yet succumbed to the forest's call, stared in horrified awe as the heart of the forest emerged. It was a mass of roots, twisted and gnarled, pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to warp the very air around it. It towered above the village, casting a shadow that swallowed everything in its path. Its presence was suffocating, an overwhelming force that pressed upon the very essence of the land. The earth trembled beneath its weight, and the very air grew heavy, charged with the power of something ancient and unspeakable. The whispers returned, louder than ever. But now they were not just voices. They were commands. They filled the air, filling the minds of the villagers with the same insatiable hunger that had taken Jacob, that had claimed the souls of their ancestors. The forest spoke not in riddles, but in promises. Promises of eternal life, of power beyond imagining, of the chance to become the forest, to merge with its eternal spirit. For those who still stood, the choice was clear. They could surrender, just as Jacob had, just as the others had. They could answer the forest's call, give up their humanity, and become part of the roots, part of the forest that would never die. Or they could fight. They could try to break the bonds that had been forged so long ago, to sever the ties that bound them to the forest's hunger. But the forest's hunger was too great. The heart of the forest reached for them. With an earth-shattering crack, the roots erupted from the earth, twisting through the air like serpents, lashing out with terrifying speed. The villagers tried to run, to flee, but the roots were faster. They coiled around them, squeezing, tightening, pulling them toward the heart of the forest. Their screams were swallowed by the earth, their bodies pulled beneath the roots, into the darkness. The village was gone. The village had always been a part of the forest, a mere echo of its power. And now there was nothing left but the roots, the heart, and the whispers. The forest had claimed them all. And as the final echoes of the village faded into silence, the heart of the forest pulsed with the rhythm of eternity, its hunger never-ending, its power eternal. For the forest did not die. It never had. It was the land. It was the roots. And it would wait forever, for the next to come, for the next to answer the call. The final embrace had come. The forest had claimed its due. And when the next village fell, when the next whispers stirred the air, the roots would rise again.